Distinguished members of Religions for Peace, it is a great honor to present these copies of The Voice of Hope, Aung San Suu Kyi from Prison and a Letter to a Dictator, to such a noble institution, and on behalf of Kim Aris. Published in early 2023, this book distills the most significant insights from Burma's Voices of Freedom, a 4-volume set of interviews first released in 2020. Together, these works illuminate two profound injustices: the vilification of Aung San Suu Kyi in the media and the unlawful imprisonment of Burma's elected civilian government by the country's military regime. The Voices of Freedom interviews were conducted by Alan Clements, a veteran journalist with over 40 years of experience in Burma, gathered over more than 30 trips of several months each between 2013 and 2020. They are documentary evidence of the thoughts, feelings, actions, and experiences of those who have given their lives to the struggle for democracy. Among them, founding members of Aung San Suu Kyi's political party, the National League for Democracy, including U Tinu and U Wintain, as well as the late Venerable Sayadaw U Pandita, the architect of the NLD's philosophy of national reconciliation. The Venerable U Pandita was also Alan Clements' preceptor when Clements himself was a Buddhist monk in Burma, and it is through these long-standing personal relationships that Clements gained unparalleled access to those at the heart of Burma's struggle. In preparing this work from a distance, I compiled several additional chapters drawn from Aung San Suu Kyi's own speeches and lectures at institutions such as Yale University and Sandhurst Military Academy. These were drawn from hundreds of thousands of words, much of which I personally transcribed, and presented alongside a detailed 70,000-word chronology of key events, informed by Burma's domestic news outlets such as the Irrawaddy, the Democratic Voice of Burma, and Mazima, as well as by research from international organizations like CARE International and the International Crisis Group. Despite the veracity of these sources, the greatest part of my learning came from transcribing and editing hundreds of hours of these interviews with activists, revolutionaries, journalists, religious leaders, and politicians over a period of 5 years. For 5 years, I lived with those voices, transcribing, cross-checking, learning, day after day, figuratively in the room with Alan and some of the most courageous and resilient voices I have heard in my lifetime. As a result of that, I can say with certainty that in all that time, through all those hours of interviews, we found no trace of prejudice, racism, or hatred toward the Rohingya from Aung San Suu Kyi or from the leadership of the National League for Democracy. On the contrary, Aung San Suu Kyi from prison contains a detailed section of her public statements directly addressing the Rohingya crisis of 2017. These statements reveal a consistent commitment to investigation, dialogue, and reconciliation, not silence, not inaction, not complicity. This is significant because Aung San Suu Kyi was near universally vilified in the Western press as being, quote, silent on the plight of the Rohingya and, quote, complicit in the genocide perpetrated against them. The well-evidenced refutation of her so-called silence presented in this book was compelling enough that in 2023 it was entered as a form of evidence at a federal court in Argentina seeking universal jurisdiction over atrocities committed against the Rohingya in Burma. By the time of this court case, Aung San Suu Kyi's name had already been relentlessly tarnished. Years before her 2019 appearance at The Hague, the accusation of silence had been repeated so often that her complicity was seen as self-evident. In the mainstream press, there had been scores of articles critical of Aung San Suu Kyi, yet none about the actual perpetrator of the genocide against the Rohingya, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. The irony, of course, is staggering. That a Nobel Peace Prize winning civilian leader of a non-violent democratic movement is held incommunicado and in solitary confinement in an undisclosed location by the actual perpetrators of genocide, perpetrators who have not only escaped condemnation, but who were recently invited to sign agreements with the UN for the repatriation of the Rohingya refugees they themselves created, is a moral conundrum we have yet to fully grasp, never mind untangle. Let me be clear. Aung San Suu Kyi was never silent. After the 2012 outbreak of intercommunal violence in Rakhine State, Aung San Suu Kyi gave interviews to the BBC, to Voice of America, to CNN-IBN. She issued statements, convened press conferences, called for investigations, and criticized the military's handling of the crisis and its failure to dampen anti-Muslim sentiment. She spoke about the need to protect ethnic rights in her very first speech in Parliament. She called the violence against the Rohingya a huge international tragedy. And when a new bill further limited Rohingya rights, she called it criminal, discriminatory, and in breach of human rights. She met with numerous ethnic MPs and representatives of leading Muslim organizations. She partnered with the Annan Foundation and carried out and implemented a comprehensive economic plan for the redevelopment of Rakhine State to address the root causes of conflict. In reality, Aung San Suu Kyi did more for the Rohingya than any politician in the 50 years before her, and her views on the crisis were not unique. They were not the product of a warped and genocidal mind, not the excuses of an autocrat. They were mainstream among Burmese intellectuals and political leaders of that time. Radio Free Asia, Mzima, Eurasia Review, Global Times, and other reputable sources in Southeast Asia provided far more balance than a cynical Western press. Figures like Minko Naing, Coco G, U Win Tin, U Win Tain, as well as international observers like Dominic Stillhart, then Director of the Red Cross, and David Rudd, then Prime Minister of Australia, corroborated her position with their own observations. And despite the reluctance of the Western press to even label the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, as a terrorist organization, journalists like Bertel Lintner and scholars like Bashar were of inestimable value in understanding the role of ARSA in the conflict, as was the European Foundation for South Asian Studies. These are no fringe lunatics, but widely respected experts. Those who persist in misrepresenting Aung San Suu Kyi's intentions at The Hague persist also in misrepresenting her intentions in refusing access to the UN fact-finding mission. The UN, however, like many world leaders, struggled under the weight of headlines and soundbites, ultimately failing to respond to intercommunal violence in Burma with any kind of coherent strategy. Even so, the 2018 independent fact-finding mission carried out by the UN did not find any evidence that Aung San Suu Kyi or her government had willingly or knowingly helped or enabled the military to carry out its attacks on the Rohingya. Likewise, the US State Department report on atrocities carried out at the same time only mentions Aung San Suu Kyi in 2 paragraphs out of hundreds of pages, providing only the barest biographical information. To reiterate, there is no material evidence that Aung San Suu Kyi or her government had aided or abetted the military's crimes. Yet her reputation was destroyed in the court of public opinion, where moral nuance was replaced by moral theatre, and where the global media found it easier to condemn a symbol than to understand a struggle. The vilification of Aung San Suu Kyi in the press had become pervasive from early 2015, when articles from out-of-touch observers like Mehdi Hassan, a renowned British journalist who is unlikely to have ever been to Burma, wrote an Al Jazeera article titled Aung San Suu Kyi's Inexcusable Silence. His article appears to be based only on the already published interviews with Aung San Suu Kyi mentioned earlier, rather than any primary source. And I repeatedly refer to this article because Hassan contradicts his title by immediately describing how Aung San Suu Kyi, quote, shamefully blamed the violence on both sides. These two opposing faults of Aung San Suu Kyi's cannot exist at the same time. Either she was silent, or she had a view that Hassan disliked. It should be borne in mind that this was a time in which intercommunal violence between Buddhists and Muslims had spread to 3 states, eliciting multiple states of emergency, not just Rakhine. There were many articles like this, dozens in fact, stretching back even further to Guy Horton's 2013 Ecologist article, one relying on rhetorical devices to create a rousing polemic, rather than on any insight or understanding. Horton asks his readers, why is Aung San Suu Kyi condoning military atrocities by being present at Armed Forces Day? A leading question where the writer conflates his interpretation with fact. Again, there is no material evidence that Aung San Suu Kyi condoned any atrocity. She was present at Armed Forces Day because she was an elected MP negotiating a democratic transition, a negotiation that would have been harmed if she had snubbed the generals by being absent. This was at the core of the principle of national reconciliation she had been elected to carry out. But despite Horton concluding his article by listing his Cambridge University degrees and his fellowships, national reconciliation seems a concept that is totally absent from his understanding. Others have said that Aung San Suu Kyi deliberately kept international eyes out of Rakhine State by refusing the UN fact-finding mission, that she denied the Rohingyas' right to self-identify by requesting diplomats refrain from using the term Rohingya because it was inflammatory. But she partnered with the Annan Foundation to conduct a year-long investigation, inviting international eyes in, and used the term Rakhine Muslim, a term that has an implicit recognition of their citizenship, something Min Aung Hlaing denied when he refused to refer to the Rohingya as anything except Bengalis or foreigners. Behind the noise is a simple truth. If Aung San Suu Kyi had been complicit in genocide, journalists would not have had to accuse her of being silent. They would have been able to use her words in which she was complicit with genocide. Hatred is hard to hide. There would be statements like, there are no Rohingya in Burma, or that the Rohingya are unfinished business from the Second World War. Both statements from Min Aung Hlaing. Consider that Aung San Suu Kyi spent her time as an MP calling for citizenship rights for the Rohingya in line with international standards, and contrast this to some of the statements about Muslims in Gaza made more recently by ministers in Israel. I do not believe that the misrepresentation of Aung San Suu Kyi was born of malice, but of fatigue. A failure to grasp a political process too intricate, too unglamorous for easy headlines. Yet that failure had real consequences. Research by organizations like CARE International and the Yusof Ishaq Institute have shown that Western reporting deepened the crisis, exacerbated the violence, deepened nationalism, and strengthened the military's hand. At its core, this was not just a crisis of information, but of moral imagination. Aung San Suu Kyi called her movement a revolution of the spirit, a revolution that began in the heart, rooted in compassion, forgiveness, and the hope of redemption, even for one's enemies. This is what national reconciliation truly means: the moral courage to rise above vengeance in a world increasingly enthralled by it. And so, members of Religions for Peace, I offer these copies of Aung San Suu Kyi from Prison and A Letter to a Dictator, in the hope that they may assist your understanding of Burma's complex landscape, and of the tragic fall and enduring faith of one of the world's most iconic voices